scripture lesson for today is coming out of Exodus, the 16th chapter, verses 1 through 4 and 9 through 15. And this is what it says. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in a cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am your God." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." You know, this week, there's been something going on that's captured the attention of people all around the world. That news has been coming out of Tokyo at the delayed 2020 Olympics. I'm one of those people who can watch about anything that comes on during the Olympics. This week, I watched swimming, gymnastics, diving, BMX racing, even water polo. I watched the men's triathlon. I even noticed Flora Duffy, the women's triathlete who won Bermuda's first gold medal. I'm always impressed by the dedication and physical and mental conditioning needed to compete at that level. Like many people, I watched Simone Biles in the preliminary rounds of team gymnastics, but I was most impressed by her when she made that wise decision to pull out of the competition when she realized she was not in the headspace to safely continue. As she described it, she experienced what's called twisties, which causes disorientation where you can't tell up from down. I feel that way sometimes, don't you? But she didn't complain. She didn't make excuses. She just did what she knew what was best for her. There was something about that decision that moved me to realize there are blessings that can come from even the most disappointing and confusing of circumstances. When I noticed the outpouring of support for Simone Biles after she chose self-care and safety over pushing forward to meet somebody else's expectations. And when I read that even for her, she said it was good for her to realize that people were able to see her for more than just being the greatest of all time in gymnastics. As I thought about that, I thought about this text some more, that blessings come in many forms if we're centered enough to see them. There was a blessing for Simone Biles in her decision, but there was also a blessing for the woman who ended up winning, and there was a blessing for the whole team. There are blessings to be found in most situations in our lives. That is, if we're open enough to receive them. I read something by Richie Norton who said, sometimes blessings come in ugly wrapping paper. Blessings in ugly wrapping paper. The text for today is an example of some of those incognito blessings. Our text comes out of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, book of Exodus. Contrary to what some of us were taught, Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible. Biblical scholars believe the book of Exodus was written in the 6th century BCE, when the people of Israel were coming out of or enduring captivity. When the text was written, the audience was living in a condition that was reminiscent of what their ancestors went through in the time of slavery in Egypt. In their case, it was not Pharaoh who was their oppressor. It was Babylonian and Persian leadership who were the tyrants in the 6th century BCE. The book of Exodus is a literary, pastoral, liturgical, and theological response to an acute crisis. And in an imperial context, the book of Exodus becomes a counter document that voices and legitimates the odd identity of this community that was suffering under this oppression in the face of an empire that wanted to crush them. It's to this community that the writer is attempting to remind them of a God who's present and who will provide even in the middle of our wilderness experiences. Also, this writer let them know it's okay to have a real relationship with God, that God really is there and God really cares, to the point that we can complain to God and still be a recipient of God's grace. You know, sometimes I laugh when I read Exodus because the people complained so much. They complained, then they were blessed. Then they complained again, then they were blessed. And they complained and they were blessed. Isn't that how life is? We complain, then we're blessed. And then we complain again. But in this text, these people were complaining, as we do sometimes, because they had real problems. In the case of the text, it's that they didn't have food and they didn't have water. You know, complaints have gotten a bad rap in our society because they're most often considered to be a negative thing. But even though they're often viewed negatively, complaints are still very prevalent in our culture. And I read somewhere that complaints are an understandable consequence of a human brain because our brains are geared towards survival. So in many ways, we're wired for negatives. I read in Psychology Today that our brains receive negatives in a ratio of 5-to-1 in comparison to positive thoughts. From that perspective, it's easier to understand the story told in the text about people who had left bondage in Egypt, where they were being oppressed, but still complained repeatedly, even after their liberation. It's because they were trying to survive. They were asking for things that were needed for survival. They were asking for food. They were asking for water. And they complained to Moses, and by extension, they complained to God. But you know, I also read and I actually realized that a complaint is a necessary component to any healthy relationship. I'm not talking about constant complaints with never any positives and no good times. But sometimes a complaint is a very intimate vehicle of communication. It can unblock or help avoid built up stress and tension. Or perhaps that's why this writer decided to tell this story to the Israelites in the 6th century BCE. Under their crushing experience of exile in Babylon and under Persian control, complaining to God would have been an acceptable form of release. How many times have we felt like complaining to God, but we didn't complain because somebody told us that that wasn't an acceptable thing to do? But wouldn't it be helpful if we could just go ahead, even in 2021, and complain to God if we believe there's a creator or a higher power with whom we can have a real relationship, with whom we can really communicate? If we can, we may as well be honest and communicate even our complaints and even our concerns. Why? Because we live in a situation, we live in a life where there are things for us to complain about. Evil still does seem to prosper. The poor still seem to get poorer. Even housing we read about lately is more difficult to find and maintain. There's still sickness that attacks our bodies and claims the lives of our loved ones. We know what's going on with this Delta variant, but we still live among people who seem not to care and don't wear their mask and fight against masks and won't do what's right and get their vaccines. We still have political forces that operate out of a space of supremacy and fear, and they block change that would be positive for the masses, and they make things harder for democracy. How many of us watched what was going on in DC this weekend when we heard about what happened on January 6th? And then we still hear that people are trying to come up with this counter narrative to make it seem like it was just another day, with tourists coming through the Capitol. And then we add to that our individual interpersonal relationship issues. And yes, we have much that we could and probably should complain about just to release the pressure. Our complaint may not change anything immediately. It may not yield any external change at all, but it can cause an internal release, and it might even trigger a theological response that might help us interpret things around us from a higher point of view, where it's about more than us, where it's about maybe God's working something for the good of a greater good than just for us. From that perspective, even our view of an answer or a blessing could be better understood. Because there are times in our lives when even our expectations are so stringent that we don't understand our blessings when they come our way, or we don't understand when we're being used as part of a blessing for ourselves or for someone else. That's why every week I end our final prayer with the sentence, help us not only to see our blessings, but help us to be a blessing. That's what happens in the text. A blessing shows up, but the people don't recognize it as such. They complained and Moses prayed, but apparently the people weren't expecting a response. Something happened, but they didn't recognize when God sent the bread in a new form, even though they had been warned it was coming. When we pray about something, when we ask God about something, when we complain to God about something, we ought to be able to have some level of expectancy that God hears and will respond. Because often God does respond, but it doesn't look like what we expected. The text says that when God sent a substance that was so abundant that it looked like frost on the ground, the people asked each other, "What is it?" Because it didn't look like what they expected in return. Moses had to tell them what it was. And that's something that we can do for each other, because oftentimes we're blessed, but we don't see the blessing. But we can help each other when we complain to each other. We can stop and listen to the complaints. And then we can, first of all, acknowledge the concern that the person expresses to us. And then we can empathize with that person. But then we can help them to find something to celebrate or to hang on to, even through what looks like a bad situation. Because even in the worst of times, there's usually something for which we can be grateful. I read something from Maya Angelou. It said, "The thing to do, it seems to me, is to prepare yourself so you can be a rainbow in somebody else's cloud. Somebody who may not look like you, may not call God the same name you call God, if they call God at all. I may not dance your dances or speak your language, but be a blessing to somebody." That's what I think. That's what Maya Angelou said, and I agree with her. Be a blessing to somebody. I'm glad today because I know that in spite of all the challenges that we may face in our lives and all of the issues that might cause us to complain, I'm glad to know there really is a power that is not only gracious enough to hear us, but also surrounds us by blessing us in large and in small ways. Like the former captives in the text, we might be looking right at our blessing and saying to ourselves or to each other, what is it? But trust, although it may be incognito, your blessings really are there. Thank you for listening.